I want to spend real time here, because the night itself, as electrifying as it was, is not the story I most want to tell you. The night was one night. What came after is what changed the world, and what came after was built in enormous part by women. In 1970, a group of lesbian women in New York published a document that became one of the most important texts in the history of feminist and lesbian thought. It was called The Woman Identified Woman. The women who wrote it had come from both the women's liberation movement and the gay liberation movement, and had found themselves marginalized in both. They had a different analysis, a different politics, a different understanding of what liberation actually required. The document opened with the question, "What is a lesbian?" And then it answered, "A lesbian is the rage of all women condensed to the point of explosion. Not a definition of sexual orientation, not a medical category, not a description of who you were attracted to. A political statement, a declaration that the lesbian, the woman who refused to orient her entire existence around men and male approval, was the woman who had taken feminist politics to their logical conclusion. The lesbian was the woman who had, in the most fundamental way, refused." This document was not politely received. It was controversial in every direction among heterosexual feminists, among gay men, among lesbian women who understood their identity differently. But it was serious and it was influential, and it changed how lesbian identity was understood and articulated for a generation. The radical lesbians wrote it, distributed it, stood behind it, and almost nobody outside of specialized academic circles knows their names. Let me take you back slightly earlier, before Stonewall, to tell you about two women who had been building the infrastructure of lesbian liberation for 15 years before the night that everyone else remembers. Del Martin and Phyllis Lyon founded the Daughters of Bilitis in San Francisco in 1955. 1955, 14 years before Stonewall. Two women in love with each other, looking at a world that had absolutely no place for them. No organization, no publication, no political movement, no community infrastructure of any kind, and deciding to build one. The Daughters of Bilitis was the first lesbian organization in the United States. It started as a small social club, a place where lesbian women could meet, socialize, exist in company without fear, and grew into something much larger, an organization with a national reach. A publication called The Ladder and a political purpose. The Ladder was the first nationally distributed lesbian publication in the United States. It ran for 16 years. It provided to lesbian women across a country that had nothing else to offer them the evidence that they existed, that they were not alone, that there were others in other cities, in other circumstances, living the same life, and feeling the same feelings, and thinking the same thoughts. For women in small towns, women in conservative families, women who had no community around them, The Ladder was a lifeline, a monthly proof that they existed. Del Martin and Phyllis Lyon also fought. They lobbied, they testified, they challenged the American Psychiatric Association's classification of homosexuality as a mental illness, a battle that was finally won in 1973 when the APA removed homosexuality from the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. This was one of the single most important victories in the history of LGBTQ rights, because so much depended on that diagnosis. The institutionalization, the custody cases, the firings, the legal framework for treating gay and lesbian people as mentally ill rather than simply different. That victory was the result of years of advocacy, of research, of argument, and Del Martin and Phyllis Lyon were among its most important architects. They eventually married each other in 2004, when California briefly allowed same-sex marriages. They were the first couple to marry on that day, a moment that was both joyful and symbolic. Del Martin died 2 months later at the age of 87 with Phyllis Lyon at her side. They had been together for 56 years. There is a woman whose name almost nobody knows, who is responsible for one of the most practically important victories in the history of LGBTQ rights. Her name was Barbara Gittings. She was a lesbian activist who had been in Volvi. I want to be honest with you about something. The story of lesbian women and the broader LGBTQ movement is not a simple story of exclusion and reclamation. It is a story full of genuine conflict, genuine disagreement, and genuine failures on multiple sides. Lesbian women were, in some movements of the 1970s, not simply excluded. They were also, sometimes, exclusionary. Some lesbian feminist circles in the 1970s held positions on trans women that were harmful and that the broader LGBTQ community has since, correctly, rejected. The relationships between different communities within the broader umbrella were not simply about solidarity. They were also about power, territory, and conflicting ideas about what liberation actually required. This is the truth of almost every social movement. The people who have been marginalized do not automatically become free of the impulse to marginalize others. The experience of oppression does not guarantee a politics of solidarity. Sometimes people who know what exclusion feels like replicate its logic in different directions. Understanding this doesn't excuse the exclusions, but it complicates the story in ways that are important. The LGBTQ movement, at its best, has been a coalition. An argument, sometimes a loud and painful argument, about how to build a world where everyone in the coalition can actually live freely. The argument is ongoing. It was ongoing in 1969, and it is ongoing now. The women who were at Stonewall, and who built the movement after Stonewall, were part of that argument. Their contributions were real. Their failures and limitations were also real. History asks us to hold both. Let's talk about what was actually won. Not abstractly, specifically. In 1969, the year of Stonewall, homosexuality was a crime in 49 of the 50 United States. By 2003, the Supreme Court's decision in Lawrence versus Texas struck down the last remaining sodomy laws in the country, finally making same-sex intimacy legal everywhere in America. That's 34 years from Stonewall to the end of criminal homosexuality in the United States. In 1973, 4 years after Stonewall, the American Psychiatric Association removed homosexuality from its list of mental disorders. The campaign that achieved this had been building for years before Stonewall. Del Martin, Phyllis Lyon, Barbara Giddings, and others had been working toward it for a long time. But Stonewall changed the political temperature in ways that made the APA vote possible. In 1993, the first major national march on Washington for lesbian, gay, and bi equal rights and liberation attracted somewhere between 300,000 and 800,000 people, the largest civil rights march in Washington since the 1960s. In 2015, the Supreme Court's decision in Obergefell v. Hodges made marriage equality the law of the land across the United States. Each of these victories was built on the previous one. Each was the result of years of organizing, arguing, lobbying, marching, suing, and refusing to accept a world that said the answer was no. And in the chain of causation that runs from Stonewall to marriage equality, the women, the lesbian women, the trans women, the women of color who were in that bar and in those organizations and at those marches, are part of every link. They did not do it alone, but it could not have been done without them. I want to spend a moment with some names, because one of the things this episode is about, one of the things this channel is about, is recovering the names. The people who were there, who built things, who changed history, and who are not in the story as it is usually told. Carla J., one of the founders of the Gay Liberation Front, author of some of the movement's earliest documents, who spent decades as a scholar and activist, and who is barely mentioned in mainstream accounts of the movement she helped build. Joan Nestle, co-founder of the Lesbian History Archives in New York, which she established in 1974 to preserve exactly the kind of history this episode is trying to recover.
Let me bring you back to Stormy DeLavery, because I want to end with her. She lived until 2014. She was 93 years old when she died in a nursing home in Brooklyn, having been diagnosed with dementia in the years prior. The woman who had walked these streets for decades with a gun in her belt, keeping watch, protecting the community she had helped, in one critical moment to awaken, was at the end no longer able to remember those nights. But the people she had protected remembered her. When she died, tributes came from across the community she had served. People who had been protected by her on these streets. People who had witnessed her in that moment outside the stone wall. People who had simply known her. The guardian, the presence, the woman who had decided that this was her block. These were her people, and she was not going to let anything happen to them if she could help it. There is a thing that happens when communities lose their elders. The people who were there, who know what it was actually like, who hold the specific weight of having been present in the moments that mattered, begin to disappear. And with them disappears the living testimony, the first-person account, the woman who could look you in the eye and say, "I was there." I turned to the crowd. I watched it change. Storma de Lavery was there. She watched the crowd change. And then she spent the next 45 years making sure that what that crowd had started on that hot June night in a bar on Christopher Street was not taken back. She deserves a monument. She deserves her name in the history books. She deserves, at the very least, to be as well known as the names that have dominated the Stonewall story. This is one small attempt to give her that. What did the women of Stonewall leave us? Not just a night, not just a riot. Something much more specific and much more durable. They left us the knowledge that anger, properly directed, can crack history open. They left us the organizations, the Gay Liberation Front, the Daughters of Bilitis, the Lesbian History Archives, Kitchen Table Press, the Radical Lesbians, that turned one night of rage into a lasting movement. They left us the writing, the essays and poems and novels and documents that gave the movement its intellectual backbone and its emotional depth. They left us the template. The proof that when the world decides you don't have the right to exist in public, you go public anyway. And they left us something else, something harder to name, but perhaps the most important of all, the understanding that liberation is not given. It is not granted by a government that decides to be merciful. It is not awarded to a community that has waited long enough and been patient enough and asked politely enough. It is taken. Not with violence, though there was some of that on Christopher Street on that June night, but with presence, with refusal, with the decision, made by hundreds of people simultaneously on a street in Greenwich Village in 1969, that tonight is different. We are not going to scatter. We are not going to comply. We are not going to make this easy for the people who have decided we don't deserve to exist. We are going to stand here, in the street, in public, together. And we are not going to move. That is what the women of Stonewall left us, the street that they refused to leave. If this episode gave you a name you hadn't heard before, if you learned something about who was actually in that crowd and what they built in the weeks after, share this with someone. These names deserve to circulate. These stories deserve to be known. Drop the name of a woman from this episode in the comments. The one you're going to look up next. Let's build the list together. Next episode, we're going somewhere even darker, the Lavender Scare. The moment the United States government decided that gay and lesbian people were a national security threat and launched a systematic campaign to find and fire every single one of them. It is one of the least known episodes in American political history, and the women it targeted were extraordinaire.